the quiet heritage apple lineages preserved across the plain orchards of rural America were never the apples that filled the wooden crates of commercial cold storage warehouses, never the apples that traveled in refrigerated rail cars from Pennsylvania orchard country to the urban grocery distribution centers of Philadelphia and Newark and Boston, and never the apples that the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture cataloged in its commercial varietal recommendation lists of 1947 through 1975. But they were the apples that the 17th century, 18th century, and 19th century American homestead orchards had been built upon, beginning with the Roxbury Russet, first selected in the village of Roxbury, Massachusetts, in calendar year 1647 by the colonial settler Joseph Warren, the earliest named American apple variety in the documentary record, followed across the next 2.5 centuries by the yellow Newtown Pippin, recorded in Newtown, Long Island in the 1700s, and famously exported in 1838 to Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, by the Esopus Spitzenburg, first described in Ulster County, New York, in calendar year 1790, by the Smith cider variety recorded in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in calendar year 1796 as a dedicated Pennsylvania cider apple, by the Cox's Orange Pippin, first selected by the retired English brewer Richard Cox in Colnbrook, Buckinghamshire, England, in calendar year 1830, and carried across the Atlantic in subsequent decades by emigrant nurserymen, and by the Stamen wine sap, selected by the physician and amateur pomologist Dr. Joseph Stamen in Leavenworth, Kansas, in calendar year 1866. And these 6 varieties together formed the working vocabulary of the late 19th century Pennsylvania heritage orchard, which expanded across Lancaster County between calendar year 1875 and calendar year 1905, as the Old Order Amish settlement on the limestone soils east of the Susquehanna River entered its 3rd generation of land tenure, and as the Autumn Cider Press became a fixed seasonal fixture of the Plain farmstead, and then between calendar year 1947 and calendar year 1975, the American commercial sweet cider economy consolidated upon a small number of regional pasteurized cider cooperatives operating under uniform Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture sanitation guidance, of which the Lancaster Cider Cooperative at Akron, Pennsylvania, founded on May 6, 1947, at 218 East Main Street in the borough of Akron, came to control approximately 67% of Lancaster County's commercial sweet cider output by calendar year 1974, and during this same span, the heritage plain orchards of District 6 and District 7 east of Bird in Hand passed almost entirely outside the cooperative purchase network and continued the unpasteurized wild fermentation cider method that had been practiced on those same hillsides since the 1830s, and then beginning in calendar year 1975 and accelerating through autumn 1978 and into calendar year 1981. The American hard cider revival, emerging out of the Hudson Valley of New York and the Champlain Valley of Vermont, reached southward into Lancaster County in search of the very heritage varieties and the very wild fermentation methods that the commercial pasteurized cooperative economy had 30 years earlier dismissed as outside its processing line, and the documentary record of that reversal is the subject of the present chronicle. The Lancaster County commercial apple industry, between calendar year 1947 and calendar year 1975 was organized around 4 large pasteurization and bottling operations, of which the Lancaster Cider Cooperative at Akron was the largest by processed gallon throughput, alongside the Hess Brothers fruit packing operation at Manheim Pike, north of Lancaster City, the Akron Borough Apple Storage Association at the western edge of the same borough, and the Whitmoyers Pure Cider Mill, operated by the Whitmoyer family at 411 South Queen Street in the city of Lancaster, which functioned principally as a downstream retail and small-volume bottling outlet for cooperative pressed product. And across the 28 calendar years from May 1947 to October 1975, the Lancaster Cider Cooperative's processed sweet cider throughput grew from an inaugural year figure of 42,000 gallons in calendar year 1947 to a peak year figure of 2,184,000 gallons in calendar year 1972, a 52-fold increase achieved by sustained capital investment in pasteurization tanks, in stainless steel grinder lines manufactured by the Good Nature Products Company of Buffalo, New York, in commercial bulk apple procurement contracts that bound 47 contracted Lancaster County orchard farms to deliver their entire commercial harvest at the prevailing commodity wholesale rate, and in retail distribution agreements with the regional Acme Markets chain headquartered in Philadelphia and the Weiss Markets chain headquartered in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. And during this same span, the cooperative's general manager, Mervyn Gaiman, third-generation Gaiman family operator and 34-year cooperative veteran, came to be recognized within the Pennsylvania commercial cider industry as the principal advocate for the uniform pasteurization and stabilization standard that the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture formally adopted as voluntary industry guidance in calendar year 1968 and effectively as procurement precondition across the cooperative network by calendar year 1971. In parallel with the Pennsylvania consolidation, the American hard cider sector, which had collapsed in the early 20th century under the combined pressure of prohibition between 1920 and 1933, and the subsequent reorientation of the post-repeal American alcoholic beverage market toward distilled spirits and beer rather than fermented fruit beverages, began a slow but identifiable revival in the late 1960s and early 1970s, built upon small-batch craft producers in the Hudson Valley of New York, the Champlain Valley of Vermont, and a handful of farm cidery operations in coastal Massachusetts, leading to the November 14th, 1972, founding of the American Hard Cider Federation at a meeting of 17 producers held at the Old Drovers Inn in Dover Plains, New York, which by calendar year 1976 had grown to 41 member cidery operations, and which began that same year to actively seek out heritage variety supply lines outside the commercial pasteurized cooperative network. Since the high-tannin and high-acid cider apple varieties required for genuine American hard cider had been substantially pulled out of commercial orchard rotation between 1947 and 1965 in favor of the eating apple varieties preferred by the pasteurized sweet cider trade. And across the same span, the plain orchards of District 6, east of Bird in Hand, had preserved the wild fermentation method substantially unchanged from the 1830s on a small number of family farmsteads, of which the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead of the Stoltzfus family was by the autumn of 1965 one of 7 surviving operations in the district still operating a hand-built single-screw oak cider press as a primary autumn enterprise, and the survival of those 7 operations across the consolidation decades is the historical condition that the present chronicle proceeds to describe. In the October of 1965, on an 80-acre rolling hillside 3 miles east of Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, in the 18th row of an 1898 heritage apple orchard planted by Daniel Stoltzfus's grandfather, Stephen Stoltzfus, a 33-year-old Amish thresher named Daniel Stoltzfus, and his 28-year-old wife, Rebecca Stoltzfus, turned the hand-cranked iron screw of a hand-built oak cider press for the first autumn pressing of the post-marriage crop year, completing the inaugural pressing on the afternoon of October 14, 1965, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon under a clear South Pennsylvania autumn sky. And the press they turned that afternoon stood inside a 12 by 16-foot pine board and batten outbuilding, which Daniel had built 3 years earlier in the autumn of 1962, specifically as the dedicated cider pressing structure for the Cherry Hill farmstead, positioned 18 feet east of the 1898 Fieldstone smokehouse on the south-facing slope of the hillside directly south of the white-clapboard farmhouse. And the orchard from which the apples had been picked that morning had been planted 67 years earlier in the autumn of calendar year 1898 by Daniel's paternal grandfather, Stephen Stoltzfus, then 42 years of age, who had set 24 bare-root grafted apple whips into shovel-dug planting holes across 6 rows of 4 trees each on the south-facing hillside slope, with each variety occupying 4 trees of 1 full row, and those 6 varieties ordered in the planting sequence that Stephen Stoltzfus recorded in his 1898 planting ledger on the kitchen table of the Cherry Hill farmhouse on the evening of November 4, 1898, were the yellow Newtown Pippin, first selected on Long Island in the 1700s and famously exported to the table of Queen Victoria in 1838, and recorded by Thomas Jefferson as among his favored varieties at Monticello, the Roxbury Russet first named in Roxbury, Massachusetts, in calendar year 1647 as the oldest documented American apple variety. The Esopus Spitzenburg, first selected in Ulster County, New York, in calendar year 1790. The Stamen Winesap, selected by Dr. Joseph Stamen of Leavenworth, Kansas, in calendar year 1866. The Smith cider, recorded in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in calendar year 1796 as a classic Pennsylvania cider apple. And the Cox's Orange Pippin, first selected by Richard Cox in Buckinghamshire, England, in calendar year 1830, and carried into Lancaster County in calendar year 1864 by a Strasburg borough nurseryman named Pickle, whose family operated a small grafting nursery on the Strasburg Pike from approximately 1858 onward, and by the autumn of 1965, the 24 grafted trees stood at 67 years of age, well within the upper plateau of the heritage apple-bearing curve for these particular varieties on south-facing limestone-derived soils. And the trees yielded that first post-marriage crop year an aggregate of approximately 3,180 pounds of cider-grade fruit, which Daniel and Rebecca processed across 9 pressings between October 14th and November 6th of calendar year 1965 into 380 gallons of fresh sweet cider, of which 220 gallons were sold within the 10-day fresh window, primarily to neighboring old-order Amish households in Districts 5, 6, and 7, and to 2 regular English buyers in Bird in Hand and Intercourse, with the remaining 160 gallons racked into hand-built 30-gallon white oak fermentation barrels in the cedar-lined cellar beneath the cider house to begin the slow wild fermentation that would produce the year's hard cider for bottle aging into calendar year 1966. And the gross income from the inaugural pressing of the post-marriage crop year of 1965 was, as Rebecca recorded in the Cider House Ledger on the evening of November 22nd, $84.16. The cider house that Daniel Stoltzfus had completed in the autumn of calendar year 1962 was the smallest of the 4 working outbuildings on the Cherry Hill farmstead, smaller than the 1898 Fieldstone Smokehouse to its west, smaller than the Spring House at the foot of the hill, and smaller than the Soap House at the northwest corner of the yard. And it had been built specifically as the dedicated cider pressing structure because Daniel had judged that the Spring House pressing arrangement under which the family had operated through 3 prior generations was inadequate to the production volumes the heritage orchard was then yielding, and that a separate purpose-built structure with a buried fermentation cellar was required to preserve the wild fermentation method against the temperature variability of an above-grade pressing floor, and the structure that Daniel built between September 4th and November 11th of calendar year 1962, with the assistance of his cousin Aaron Lapp and his brother-in-law Levi Byler, across 13 full work days, measured 12 feet wide by 16 feet long, was framed with white oak posts and rafters drawn from the Cherry Hill woodlot, sheathed in vertical pine board and batten siding, milled at the real sawmill at Smoketown, roofed in hand-split white oak shingles, and floored in a poured stone and mortar slab that Daniel mixed himself from limestone sand drawn from the Pequea Creek bottom. And inside that structure stood, on the afternoon of October 14th, 1965, when Daniel and Rebecca turned the first post-marriage screw, a hand-built single-screw oak cider press, standing 5 feet tall in white oak, with a hand-forged iron screw fabricated by the blacksmith Jacob Reel of Gap, Pennsylvania, in the spring of calendar year 1962, at a fabrication charge of $14.50, a horsehair pressing mat sewn by Rebecca's mother, Sarah Esch, during the winter of calendar year 1962 to 1963, a hand-built oak apple grinder known by the traditional Pennsylvania German name of the Scratter, equipped with 2 cast-iron knife discs, forged by the same Jacob Reel in March of calendar year 1963, a cedar-lined fermentation cellar dug 4 feet into the south slope of the hillside directly beneath the cider house, and accessible through a low wooden trapdoor cut into the east end of the floor slab. 12 hand-built white oak fermentation barrels, each of 30-gallon capacity, constructed by the Cooper Henry Fisher of New Holland between June and August of calendar year 1962, at a coopering charge of $8 per barrel. A hand-built racking siphon of 3/4-inch copper tubing, salvaged from the discarded plumbing of a 1957 dairy renovation at the Byler farmstead, and a small pine cooper's bench on which Daniel kept the hoop driver, the bung mallet, the cleaning brushes, and the wooden gauge for hoop spacing, and the entire pressing protocol was governed by an unbroken household practice of wild fermentation only, meaning that no commercial Saccharomyces yeast was ever added at any stage of the process, that no potassium sorbate or sulfite preservative was ever introduced into either the sweet cider or the hard cider stream, and that no fining agent or clarifying agent of any description was permitted in the racking or the bottling, and the operation produced annually 2 distinct product streams, of which the sweet cider was sold fresh within a 10-day window, and of which the hard cider was fermented at the cellar temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit for between 6 and 14 weeks before being racked into bottle for a minimum bottle aging of 6 months. Word of the Cherry Hill cider operation moved through the southern Lancaster County commercial cider trade across the 4-year span between calendar year 1965 and calendar year 1969 along the customary informal channels by which plain orchard production was tracked by the regional pasteurized cider cooperatives. Through the conversational reports of the feed mill operators at Smoketown and at Bird in Hand, who handled the apple pomace residue from the plain pressings as livestock feed for their dairy customers. Through the routine market day observations of the English retail buyers at the Bird in Hand Farmers Market on the Wednesday morning open stall sales of late October and early November, and through the systematic regional contact mapping that the Lancaster Cider Cooperative at Akron conducted each spring across its 47 contracted growers, and across the broader set of approximately 210 non-contracted Lancaster County apple-producing farmsteads, and by spring of calendar year 1969, the Akron Cooperative's purchasing manager, Lester Geist, had entered the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead onto the cooperative's Southern Lancaster County contact log under the line item description of a heritage variety pressing operation operating outside the cooperative procurement network, with the file note that the operation pressed approximately 380 to 430 gallons of sweet cider annually, and that the operation had been under the management of the widow Rebecca Stoltzfus, following the death of Daniel Stoltzfus on February 21st of that year, and the cooperative scheduled an initial procurement visit for the autumn pressing season of calendar year 1969. In parallel with the cooperative's tracking, the Whitmoyers' Pure Cider Mill at 411 South Queen Street in Lancaster City, operated since the death of the founder Earl Whitmoyer in calendar year 1963 by his son Norbert Whitmoyer, then 52 years of age, second-generation English commercial cider retailer, was approached during the October 1970 retail buying cycle by an intermediary acting for Rebecca Stoltzfus regarding the possible retail stocking of small allotments of Cherry Hill hand-pressed sweet cider in glass half-gallon jugs at a wholesale price calibrated to a 78 cents per gallon retail, and Norbert Whitmoyer entered a brief notation in his quarterly purchasing minutes for the fourth quarter of calendar year 1970, declining the proposed stocking on the basis of the 78 cents per gallon retail differential against the prevailing commercial pasteurized cider shelf price of 18 cents per gallon, with the additional notation that he regarded the product as a small batch offering without sufficient consumer demand profile for the South Queen Street retail location. And across the same span, by summer of calendar year 1970, the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Service Lancaster County office at Farmland Road in Lancaster had also entered the Cherry Hill operation onto its file of unpasteurized cider operations in the county, under the supervision of its orchard specialist, Dr. Sherwood Helsel, 54 years of age, a 1944 graduate of the Pennsylvania State University Department of Horticulture, who had served the Lancaster County Extension Office continuously since 1948 and who was, by 1970, the principal extension authority on Lancaster County orchard sanitation. And Dr. Helsel scheduled the customary Extension Service educational outreach visit to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead for the autumn of calendar year 1971. The four senior Lancaster Cider Cooperative executives who across the 1969 to 1978 span would each at one point or another file written or verbal commentary regarding the Cherry Hill Lane operation were, in descending order of seniority, the general manager, Mervyn Gaiman, the production manager, Bertram Snyder, the purchasing manager, Lester Geist, and the quality control chemist, Dr. Hayes Stahl, and a brief biographical record of each is here entered into the chronicle, since each will appear by name in the subsequent reckoning sequence. Mervyn Gaiman, 61 years of age in calendar year 1969, third-generation Gaiman family operator of the cooperative, which his grandfather Christian Gaiman had co-founded in May of calendar year 1947, alongside the other 6 founding members of the Akron Borough Cooperative Organizing Committee, a 34-year cooperative veteran having begun his career as an apprentice apple grader in calendar year 1935, a 1929 graduate of Akron High School, resident at 412 Diamond Street in the borough of Akron, member of the Akron Mennonite Church congregation since calendar year 1923. Bertram Snyder, 57 years of age in calendar year 1969, hired into the cooperative production department in calendar year 1949 directly after his 1948 graduation from the Pennsylvania State University Department of Food Science, promoted to production manager in calendar year 1962, the principal cooperative authority on the pasteurization and bottling line that the cooperative had installed in calendar year 1956 and substantially expanded in calendar year 1971. Lester Geist, 54 years of age in calendar year 1969, hired into the cooperative purchasing department in calendar year 1952, promoted to purchasing manager in calendar year 1964. The principal cooperative authority on Lancaster County grower contracts and the executive whose office maintained the Southern Lancaster County contact log, on which the Cherry Hill Lane operation had been entered in spring 1969, and Dr. Hayes Stahl, 49 years of age in calendar year 1969, a 1947 graduate of the Pennsylvania State University Department of Food Science, with a doctorate awarded in 1955 from the Department of Microbiology of Cornell University, hired by the cooperative in calendar year 1956 as the principal quality control chemist responsible for the pasteurization sanitation regimen and for the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture compliance file, and the principal scientific voice within the cooperative for the pasteurized and stabilized standard which had been codified into the cooperative procurement contracts in calendar year 1968. The proprietor of the Whitmoyers Pure Cider Mill at 411 South Queen Street in Lancaster City, Norbert Whitmoyer, 52 years of age in calendar year 1969, second-generation English commercial cider retailer, was a 1939 graduate of Lancaster Boys High School, who had taken full management of the Queen Street operation upon the death of his father, Earl Whitmoyer, in calendar year 1963, and who, across the 6 years between 1963 and 1969, had progressively reoriented the Queen Street operation away from in-house pressing toward retail distribution of commercial pasteurized cider, sourced from the Akron Cooperative, and the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Orchard Specialist, Dr. Sherwood Helsel, 54 years of age in calendar year 1969, a 1944 graduate of the Pennsylvania State University Department of Horticulture, with a 1948 Master of Science degree from the same department and a 1957 doctorate from the Department of Plant Pathology of Cornell University, the principal Lancaster County Extension Authority on orchard sanitation and on commercial cider processing standards, resident at 1418 Marietta Avenue in Lancaster City, and the customary Extension Service representative to the Lancaster County Old Order Amish farming community across the District 1 through District 12 catchment. On the morning of November 18, 1969, at approximately 10:15 in the morning, Mervyn Gaiman and Lester Geist drove the 11 miles from the Akron facility eastward along Route 772 and southward along Route 340 to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead 3 miles east of Bird in Hand, parking the cooperative's 1968 Chevrolet sedan at the iron gate at the foot of the lane and walking the 75 yards up to the farmhouse porch where they met Rebecca Stoltzfus on the front steps and presented to her a bulk wholesale apple procurement contract drafted on the cooperative's standard 4-page printed form, offering procurement of the entire Cherry Hill annual apple crop at the prevailing 1969 commercial cider apple wholesale rate of $0.046 per pound, payable upon delivery at the Akron facility loading dock within the customary 14-day post-harvest delivery window, with annual contract renewal at the prevailing rate determined each spring by the cooperative's board of directors. And Rebecca Stoltzfus reviewed the contract on the porch, asked Mervyn Gaiman 2 clarifying questions regarding the source identification on the bottled product and the disposition of the apple pomace residue, and then declined the contract on the simple stated basis that the Cherry Hill operation captured for its hand-pressed direct sale cider an effective apple input value of approximately 84 cents per pound, an 18-fold differential against the cooperative's bulk wholesale rate, and that the heritage variety identification of the Cherry Hill apples would be lost in the cooperative's bulk pasteurized blend. Mervyn Gaiman acknowledged the decline politely, recorded the visit in the cooperative's Southern Lancaster County contact log on the afternoon of November 18th under the dry notation of a heritage orchard operator outside the cooperative processing economy, and the cooperative's procurement file on the Cherry Hill Lane operation was, for the next 9 years, effectively closed. In the October of 1970, Norbert Whitmoyer at 411 South Queen Street in Lancaster City entered the brief decline notation already cited into the fourth quarter 1970 purchasing minutes of the Whitmoyer's Pure Cider Mill, declining the proposed retail stocking on the basis of the 78 cents per gallon retail price differential against the 18 cents per gallon commercial pasteurized cider shelf price, with the supplementary characterization of the Cherry Hill product as a small batch offering without sufficient consumer demand profile for the South Queen Street retail location. And on the afternoon of September 14, 1971, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Dr. Sherwood Helsel of the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Service, Lancaster County office, drove the 14 miles from the Farmland Road Extension Office in Lancaster eastward to Cherry Hill Lane, parked at the Iron Gate, walked the 75 yards up to the farmhouse porch, and presented to Rebecca Stoltzfus a Penn State Cooperative Extension brochure titled Modern Pasteurization and Preservative Standards for Commercial Sweet Cider Production, a 16-page printed circular dated August 1971, which argued at substantial documentary length that the unpasteurized wild fermented cider method, as practiced on heritage plain orchard farmsteads in Lancaster, Berks, and Chester counties, carried unacceptable bacterial spoilage risk relative to the commercial pasteurized and potassium sorbate stabilized standard, and which recommended the universal adoption of the commercial pasteurization standard by all Lancaster County cider-producing farmsteads. Rebecca Stoltzfus accepted the brochure, thanked Dr. Helsel for the visit, and declined the recommendation on the simple stated basis that the wild fermentation method had been the practice on the Cherry Hill ground since the planting of the 1898 orchard, and Dr. Helsel recorded the visit in the Lancaster County Cooperative Extension Service Annual Report for fiscal year 1971 under the line item of a heritage orchard farmstead non-compliant with modern cider sanitation. A note from the chronicler on the documentary record. The surviving documentary foundation, upon which the present account proceeds, rests upon three principal source archives, the first being Rebecca Stoltzfus's own cider house pressing ledger, kept continuously in a single linen-bound quarto ledger book from the inaugural pressing of October 14, 1965, through the final entry of November 11, 1991, recording for each pressing the date, the variety composition, the pounds of fruit processed, the gallons of sweet cider produced, the gallons racked to fermentation, the cellar temperature at racking, the barrel identifications, and the buyer assignments. The ledger, now held in the family archive of the Stoltzfus household at Cherry Hill Lane, and consulted for this chronicle by the chronicler in calendar year 1992. The second being the Adams Antique Apples Cidery Contract file maintained at the Adams Antique Apples Cidery at 412 Warren Street in Hudson, New York, comprising the original October 17, 1981 5-year supply contract, the November 1986 5-year contract renewal, and the annual heritage variety delivery records from calendar year 1981 forward, and the third being the New York Times Magazine archive at the New York Times offices on West 43rd Street in Manhattan, comprising the working file of Cornelia Vanderveer, covering both the August 1977 Brandywine Tomato feature and the December 6, 1981 cider feature titled The Last Wild Cider in Lancaster County, including the field interview transcripts and the photographic plates by staff photographer Edmund Russell. If you find this archival approach useful, the channel proceeds at the pace of one harvest at a time. Please subscribe. The Cherry Hill Cider House Pressing Ledger across the 12 calendar years from autumn 1965 through autumn 1977, records in Rebecca Stoltzfus's careful pencil block hand, an unbroken sequence of autumn pressing campaigns, of which the relevant data points are here entered into the chronicle as the materially documented operating record of the period. In autumn 1965, the inaugural post-marriage campaign produced across 9 pressings between October 14th and November 6th a total of 380 gallons of sweet cider against 3,180 pounds of heritage fruit, of which 220 gallons were sold fresh and 160 gallons were racked to fermentation across 8 white oak barrels at an October 22nd cellar temperature of 56 degrees Fahrenheit and a November 6th cellar temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit. In autumn 1966, the campaign produced 396 gallons across 10 pressings between October 11th and November 8th, of which 230 gallons were sold fresh and 166 gallons fermented across 8 barrels. In autumn 1967, the campaign produced 412 gallons across 11 pressings between October 8th and November 14th, of which 242 gallons were sold fresh and 170 gallons fermented. In autumn 1968, the campaign produced 408 gallons across 10 pressings between October 12th and November 9th. On February 21st, 1969, at approximately 4 in the afternoon, Daniel Stoltzfus died of a thoracic aortic complication at the Lancaster General Hospital following a brief illness of 7 days, leaving Rebecca Stoltzfus widow at the age of 32 with the management of the 80-acre farmstead and the cider operation and the ledger entry for the autumn 1969 pressing campaign. The first widowed campaign was made on the evening of November 18, 1969, recording 392 gallons of sweet cider, produced across 9 pressings between October 13th and November 7th, of which 226 gallons were sold fresh and 166 gallons racked to fermentation, and was followed across subsequent pressing campaigns by 421 gallons in autumn 1970, 446 gallons in autumn 1971, 458 gallons in autumn 1972, 471 gallons in autumn 1973, 484 gallons in autumn 1974, 478 gallons in autumn 1975, 489 gallons in autumn 1976, and 492 gallons in autumn 1977, with the fermentation barrel count expanding from 8 to 12 in autumn 1971 and to 14 in autumn 1973. Corresponding to the cellar extension recorded in the building ledger entry of June 14, 1973, and the hard cider bottle aging records show across the same span an annual bottled hard cider output rising from 160 gallons in 1965 to 210 gallons in 1975 to 224 gallons in 1977, with the average bottle aging at the time of first sale rising from the contractual minimum of 6 months to an average of 11 months by autumn 1977. The customer ledger across this same span records a stable set of buyer accounts, of which the largest single English account was the Watt and Shand Tea Room at the Watt and Shand Department Store at the corner of East King Street and South Queen Street in Lancaster City, which commenced an account in the spring of calendar year 1968 under tea room manager Hattie Bowman, and which by 1977 was taking 12 gallons of fresh sweet cider weekly throughout October and November, and 12 gallons of bottled hard cider monthly throughout the year, alongside smaller accounts at the Bird in Hand family restaurant on Route 340, the Plain and Fancy Farm restaurant at Bird in Hand, and the Strasburg Country Store at Strasburg, and a working population of approximately 40 old order Amish household accounts across Districts 5, 6, 7, and 8, which together absorbed approximately 138 gallons of fresh sweet cider per autumn campaign across the 1969 to 1977 span. And through all 12 campaigns, the wild fermentation protocol remained unchanged, with no commercial yeast added, no sulfites introduced, no fining agents employed, and no pasteurization step incorporated at any point in either the sweet or the hard cider stream. Across the span between calendar year 1971 and calendar year 1976, Rebecca Stoltzfus undertook two principal expansions of the Cherry Hill cider operation, each of which is recorded in the Cider House Building Ledger, and each of which materially raised the annual processing capacity of the farmstead. The first expansion, recorded in the Building Ledger under the entry for June 14th through September 18th, 1973, was the southward extension of the cedar-lined fermentation cellar beneath the cider house by an additional 8 feet of horizontal depth into the south slope of the hillside, an excavation carried out by Rebecca's brother-in-law, Levi Byler, and her nephew, Samuel Stoltzfus, across 41 workdays in the summer of 1973, lined in fresh eastern white cedar boards milled at the Real Sawmill at Smoketown, and increasing the cellar's barrel capacity from 12 to 20 barrels at the previous standing density, and effectively raising the annual fermentation stream capacity from 360 gallons to 600 gallons. The second expansion, recorded in the Building Ledger under the entry for August 4th through October 11th, 1976, was the addition of a second hand-built single-screw oak cider press of the same 5-foot dimension as the original 1962 press, fabricated at the Cherry Hill farmstead by Rebecca's nephew, Samuel Stoltzfus, across 9 consecutive work weeks in the late summer of 1976, to a design transcribed from the original 1962 press by direct measurement, equipped with a hand-forged iron screw fabricated by the same blacksmith, Jacob Reel of Gap, Pennsylvania, at a fabrication charge of $38, against the inflation differential from the 1962 figure of $14.50, and a horsehair pressing mat sewn by Rebecca's sister-in-law, Naomi Byler, across 3 work weeks of September 1976, the addition of which permitted 2 simultaneous pressings to be run during the peak harvest window and raised the daily fresh pressing throughput from approximately 48 gallons to approximately 92 gallons. In parallel with the 2 principal expansions, Rebecca undertook smaller equipment additions across the same span, including a second scratter grinder added to the cider house floor in October 1974, a third racking siphon added in October 1975, a hand-built apple sorting table built by Samuel Stoltzfus in September 1974, and the construction of an extended west awning on the cider house in May 1976 to provide rain-protected outdoor working space during peak pressing campaigns, and the cumulative effect of the equipment expansions across the 1971 to 1976 span was to raise the annual sweet cider production from 446 gallons in 1971 to 489 gallons in 1976, and the annual hard cider bottle output from 174 gallons in 1971 to 218 gallons in 1976, with corresponding rises in the gross farmstead income from cider sales from approximately $312 in 1971 to approximately $1,840 in 1976, the latter figure reflecting both the production rise and the steady rise in the direct sale retail price across the same span from approximately 42 cents per gallon for fresh sweet cider in 1971 to approximately $1.18 per gallon in 1976. Beginning in calendar year 1975, the American grocery retail apple juice market, into which the Lancaster Cider Cooperative at Akron and the broader Pennsylvania commercial cider industry had spent the previous 28 years building both the pasteurization production capacity and the distribution architecture, entered a sustained and ultimately destabilizing disruption driven principally by the entry of a class of corn syrup-based juice substitute products marketed under brand names that retain traditional apple imagery in their packaging while substituting high fructose corn syrup, citric acid, and small fractional percentages of reconstituted apple concentrate for the substantial fresh-pressed apple content of the products they were displacing on the retail shelf. And the three principal product introductions of the disruption are here recorded in the Chronicle as the documented commercial events that they were. First, in the spring of calendar year 1975, the Coca-Cola Company reformulated the High C apple drink product under its Minute Maid juice division, substituting a corn syrup and concentrate base for the previous reconstituted apple juice base, and lowering the wholesale shelf price by approximately 22% against the previous formulation, the reformulation reaching national grocery distribution by July 1975. Second, on October 14, 1975, the Hawaiian Punch Company introduced the Hawaiian Punch Fruit Juicy Red Apple Edition, a substantially corn syrup-based product retailing at approximately 14 cents per quart against the prevailing commercial pasteurized fresh sweet cider price of 18 cents per quart, achieving 31% national grocery distribution by March 1976. And third, on March 4, 1976, the Ocean Spray Cranberries Cooperative of Plymouth, Massachusetts, introduced the Ocean Spray Apple Cranberry Juice Drink, a blended product retailing at approximately 22 cents per quart and achieving 46% national grocery distribution by August 1976. The cumulative shelf displacement effect of these three product introductions across the Eastern American grocery retail market was documented in the Pennsylvania Apple Marketing Board's December 1976 report titled The Apple Juice Shelf Survey of Eastern Pennsylvania, which recorded a 38% decline in retail shelf share of fresh-pressed and pasteurized sweet cider products across the Eastern Pennsylvania retail grocery sector between calendar year 1974 and calendar year 1976, and which was followed in October 1977 by a second Pennsylvania Apple Marketing Board report titled The Calendar Year 1976 Pennsylvania Fresh Sweet Cider Demand Assessment, which documented a 41% decline in commercial fresh-pressed sweet cider retail demand across the calendar year 1976, across the Pennsylvania and eastern Maryland market region, and the consequence of the demand decline upon the eastern Pennsylvania commercial apple production sector arrived in the autumn of calendar year 1978 in the form of the unprecedented oversupply event, known regionally as the 1978 Northeast Apple Glut, in which total Pennsylvania commercial apple production for the 1978 harvest exceeded the contracted Pennsylvania commercial processor demand by approximately 217,000 bushels, and in which the surplus apples were sold across the autumn of 1978 at commodity dump prices averaging $0.012 per pound, a 75% decline from the calendar year 1972 baseline commercial cider apple wholesale rate and the Lancaster Cider Cooperative at Akron, which operated exclusively on a bulk purchase model, paying its contracted growers at the prevailing commodity wholesale rate and which had committed itself across the calendar year 1978 procurement cycle to absorb the full contracted apple deliveries of its 47 contracted Lancaster County orchard farms, was unable to absorb its 1978 contracted apple deliveries, was forced to release 43% of those 47 contracted Lancaster County orchard farms from purchase obligations between September 14th and December 6th of calendar year 1978, and on November 14, 1978, the cooperative's general manager, Mervyn Gaiman, initiated emergency procurement outreach to small-batch heritage variety orchard operations across the Lancaster County District 1 through District 12 catchment in an attempt to reposition the cooperative product line into the emerging American hard cider revival market, of which the Cherry Hill Lane operation was the first farmstead approached. The community-level effect of the calendar year 1978 disruption across the Lancaster County commercial apple sector was registered across the autumn 1978 and winter 1978 to 1979 procurement and operation cycles in a sequence of contract releases, auction sales, and operational shutdowns that materially altered the structure of the southern Lancaster County commercial cider economy. The Lancaster Cider Cooperative at Akron released, between September 14th and December 6th of calendar year 1978, 20 of its 47 contracted Lancaster County orchard farms from purchase obligations under the 1978 standing contract. The released farms, comprising principally the larger commercial McIntosh and Red Delicious orchard operations of southern Lancaster County and northern York County, which had been the cooperative's principal sweet cider input across the 1965 to 1977 span, and 3 of the released farms, the 84-acre Hertzler orchard at the village of Bart, the 67-acre Lefevre orchard at the village of Strasburg, and the 92-acre Byler orchard at the village of Quarryville, moved to sale of standing crop at the seasonal Bart Farm auction held on December 14, 1978, at the Bart Township Livestock Auction Grounds. The 3 lots selling at clearing prices that range between 40 and 55% of the comparable 1972 baseline auction value. The Whitmoyer's Pure Cider Mill at 411 South Queen Street in Lancaster City, which had since calendar year 1971 sourced approximately 78% of its retail distributed pasteurized sweet cider directly from the Akron Cooperative under a standing wholesale agreement, recorded across calendar year 1978, a 34% decline in retail sweet cider sales against the calendar year 1977 baseline, and the operation's quarterly purchasing minutes for the fourth quarter of calendar year 1978 entered into the operation's running ledger, a notation that the South Queen Street retail location was no longer commercially viable on the standing wholesale pasteurized cider product line at the prevailing retail price points. In parallel with the Lancaster County contraction, 3 smaller commercial Pennsylvania apple processing operations closed permanently across the autumn 1978 and winter 1978 to 1979 cycle, including the Stamen Pure Cider operation at Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, which had been founded in calendar year 1923 and which closed its pressing line on December 18, 1978. The Knepp Brothers Orchard and Cider operation at Akron, Pennsylvania, which had been founded in calendar year 1949 and which closed its retail bottling line on February 4, 1979, and the Mannheim Mennonite Cider Cooperative at Mannheim, Pennsylvania, which had been founded in calendar year 1954 and which suspended its 1979 procurement cycle on March 14, 1979. The cumulative effect of the contraction across the southern Lancaster County commercial cider sector was an estimated 31% reduction in commercial pasteurized cider processing capacity between October 1, 1978 and June 1, 1979. The steepest single contraction the Pennsylvania commercial cider industry had recorded in any 9-month span across the post-repeal era, and the contraction created across the same span an effectively open competitive landscape into which the surviving heritage variety wild fermentation operations of District 6 and District 7 east of Bird in Hand, of which the Cherry Hill Lane operation was the largest single producer, entered as the principal Lancaster County supply node for the emerging American hard cider revival market, then organizing itself out of the Hudson Valley of New York and the Champlain Valley of Vermont, and the documentary record of that entry begins with the November 11, 1978 return of the Lancaster Cider Cooperative General Manager Mervyn Gaiman to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead. On the morning of November 11, 1978, at approximately 9:40 in the morning, Mervyn Gaiman drove the 11 miles from the Akron facility eastward along Route 772 and southward along Route 340 to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, the same route he had driven 9 years earlier on November 18, 1969, parked the cooperative's 1976 Chevrolet sedan at the same iron gate, walked the same 75 yards up to the farmhouse porch, and presented to Rebecca Stoltzfus a revised heritage variety procurement contract drafted on the cooperative's redesigned heritage line printed form, offering procurement of small allotments of all 6 Cherry Hill heritage varieties at the rate of 84 cents per pound. The exact direct sale apple input value Rebecca had been capturing across the preceding 13 years and an 18-fold increase over the 1969 wholesale offer, with annual contract renewal at the prevailing rate determined each spring by the cooperative's board of directors, the cooperative committing to bottle the resulting cider under a new Heritage Line product label and to market the product into the emerging American hard cider revival channel. Rebecca Stoltzfus reviewed the contract on the porch, asked Mervyn Gaiman one clarifying question regarding the source identification of the bottled product on the consumer label, and declined the contract on the simple stated basis that the cooperative declined to identify the Cherry Hill source on the bottle label, offering instead to sell Gaiman a one-time experimental allotment of 480 pounds of Stayman wine sap at $1.84 per pound. The prevailing 1978 high-end heritage variety direct retail value, contingent on the cider being bottled with the Cherry Hill source identification clearly marked on the label, and Mervyn Gaiman declined the labeling condition on the basis that the cooperative's standing branding architecture would not accommodate a single farmstead source identification. On the afternoon of October 14, 1981, at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, exactly 16 years to the afternoon from the inaugural Daniel and Rebecca pressing of October 14, 1965, a man named Cyrus Whitman parked a 1979 Ford station wagon at the iron gate at the foot of the Cherry Hill Lane and walked the 75 yards up to the farmhouse porch and introduced himself to Rebecca Stoltzfus as the proprietor of the Adams Antique Apples Cidery at 412 Warren Street in Hudson, New York. Cyrus Whitman, 53 years of age in calendar year 1981, a 1950 graduate of the Cornell University College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, with an additional 1953 Master of Science degree in pomology from the same university, founder in calendar year 1976 of the Adams Antique Apples Cidery in the small Hudson Valley craft cidery sector, then organizing itself out of the Hudson Valley emerging American hard cider revival, had driven the 217 miles from the Hudson Valley to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead that morning after reading a 1,400-word notice of the Cherry Hill Heritage Orchard in the September 1981 issue of the New England Heritage Foods Quarterly, a small circulation periodical published quarterly in Brattleboro, Vermont, and read principally by craft food producers across the northeastern United States. Whitman spent 3 days at the Cherry Hill farmstead between October 14th and October 17th of 1981, documenting in a notebook the variety composition and tree age data of the 1898 orchard, the hand-built single-screw oak cider press, and the second 1976 press, the cedar-lined fermentation cellar, and the 20 barrels then standing in the extended cellar, the wild fermentation protocol as Rebecca described it across the 3 days, and the annual pressing volumes as recorded in the cider house ledger. And on the afternoon of October 17, 1981, on the porch of the Cherry Hill farmhouse, Cyrus Whitman signed Rebecca Stoltzfus to a 5-year exclusive heritage variety supply contract. The 5-year exclusive heritage variety supply contract that Cyrus Whitman of the Adams Antique Apples Cidery and Rebecca Stoltzfus of the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead signed on the porch of the Cherry Hill farmhouse on the afternoon of October 17, 1981, was a 4-page typed document on Adams Antique Apples Cidery letterhead, which obliged the Cherry Hill farmstead to deliver to the Adams Antique Apples Cidery at 412 Warren Street in Hudson, New York, an annual allotment of 1,800 pounds of mixed Cherry Hill heritage apples, drawn proportionally from the 6 varieties of the 1898 orchard: Yellow Newtown Pippin, Roxbury Russet, Esopus Spitzenburg, Stayman Wine Sap, Smith Cider, and Cox's Orange Pippin, at a contracted per-pound delivery price of $1.18 per pound. and which obliged the Adams Antique Apple Cidery to ferment the resulting cider under the Adams Antique Apples Cidery wild-fermentation cellar protocol and to bottle the resulting product under a labeling description identifying the product as the 1898 Cherry Hill Lane, Lancaster County Heritage 6 line, with the Cherry Hill source identification clearly printed in 12-point type on the front face of each 750-milliliter bottle, and the total contracted first-year contract value of the agreement was $2,124 against Rebecca Stoltzfus's calendar year 1980 aggregate farmstead operating income of $9,140, the new contract therefore representing approximately 23% of the farmstead's projected calendar year 1981 operating income at signing. On the afternoon of November 14, 1981, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, the New York Times Magazine food editor Cornelia Vanderveer, who had first visited the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead in August 1977 for the Brandywine Tomato feature published in the September 11, 1977 New York Times Magazine, drove the 158 miles from her West 43rd Street Manhattan office southward across the New Jersey Turnpike and westward across the Pennsylvania Turnpike to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead, accompanied by the New York Times staff photographer Edmund Russell, and spent 2 days at the farmstead between November 14th and November 15th of 1981, documenting the cider operation and the Adams Antique Apples cidery contract for a Sunday New York Times Magazine feature article, and on December 6, 1981, the 5,200-word feature appeared in the Sunday New York Times Magazine under the title The Last Wild Cider in Lancaster County, occupying 8 pages of the magazine with 6 full-page photographic plates by Edmund Russell of the 1898 orchard, the cider house, the hand-built single-screw oak cider press, the cedar-lined fermentation cellar, the 20 fermentation barrels, and a portrait of Rebecca Stoltzfus at the threshold of the cider house at dawn on November 15, 1981. The December 6, 1981 New York Times Magazine feature was followed across the subsequent weeks by a 1,200-word piece in the Hudson Valley Heritage Press on November 22, 1981, describing the Adams Antique Apples cidery acquisition of the Cherry Hill Heritage Supply Line, and by a longer review piece in the Pennsylvania Heritage Quarterly Spring 1982 issue, published on March 14, 1982, under the title Lancaster County's Heritage Apple Survivors, which featured the Cherry Hill operation alongside 6 other surviving heritage variety farmstead orchards in the southern Lancaster County region. And across the calendar years 1982, 1983, 1984, 1985, and 1986, the Cherry Hill farmstead delivered the contracted 1,800 pounds annually to the Adams Antique Apples cidery at the contracted $1.18 per pound rate. The contract value rising across the contract term by mutually agreed annual escalation to a 5th-year contracted value of $2,512 in calendar year 1985, against which the Cherry Hill aggregate farmstead operating income rose across the same span from $9,140 in calendar year 1980 to $14,840 in calendar year 1985. The reckoning sequence across the 4 senior Lancaster cider cooperative executives The Whitmoyers Pure Cider Mill proprietor at 411 South Queen Street in Lancaster City, and the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Orchard Specialist, Dr. Sherwood Helsel, proceeded across the 43-month span between November 1978 and June 1982. In the sequence of dated events here entered into the chronicle as the documentary record of that reckoning. On November 11, 1978, Mervyn Gaiman's revised heritage variety procurement offer at 84 cents per pound was declined by Rebecca Stoltzfus on the porch of the Cherry Hill farmhouse, as the Chronicle has already recorded. On April 14, 1979, Norbert Whitmoyer of the Whitmoyers Pure Cider Mill at 411 South Queen Street in Lancaster City wrote a brief one-page letter on Whitmoyers Pure Cider Mill letterhead inquiring about the possibility of stocking a small allotment of Cherry Hill bottled hard cider at the South Queen Street retail location at the prevailing 1979 retail price points, and Rebecca Stoltzfus replied by post on April 28, 1979, offering a one-time consignment of 12 gallons of bottled hard cider at the prevailing $4.40 per gallon wholesale rate. The offer declined by Norbert Whitmoyer in a follow-up letter dated May 14, 1979, on the basis that a 12-gallon consignment was below the minimum stocking threshold of the South Queen Street retail location. On March 18, 1980, the Lancaster Cider Cooperative at Akron entered partial receivership before the Lancaster County Court of Common Pleas. The receivership proceeding, initiated by three of the cooperative's standing creditors, including the Penn Square National Bank of Lancaster and the Good Nature Products Company of Buffalo, New York. On October 14, 1980, Mervyn Gaiman, 72 years of age, retired from the position of general manager of the Lancaster Cider Cooperative after a 45-year career with the cooperative. On February 4, 1981, the cooperative's production manager, Bertram Snyder, 69 years of age, took employment at a small commercial fruit processing facility at New Holland, Pennsylvania. On May 14, 1981, the Whitmoyers Pure Cider Mill at 411 South Queen Street in Lancaster City closed its retail operation permanently. The South Queen Street storefront sold at auction on July 22, 1981, and released to a Lancaster City furniture retailer on June 4, 1981. Dr. Sherwood Helsel of the Pennsylvania State University Cooperative Extension Service Lancaster County Office, 66 years of age, and within 7 months of his planned January 14, 1982 retirement, wrote a 3-page letter on Penn State Cooperative Extension letterhead, formally retracting the September 14, 1971 non-compliance notation that he had entered into the Lancaster County Cooperative Extension Service annual report for fiscal year 1971 against the Cherry Hill Lane operation, acknowledging the 73-year unblemished safety record of the wild-fermentation method as practiced on the Cherry Hill ground, and inviting Rebecca Stoltzfus to contribute her household method to a forthcoming Penn State Extension educational publication titled Heritage Orchard Preservation in Lancaster County. A documentary record. The contribution declined by Rebecca Stoltzfus in a reply by post dated June 22, 1981, on the simple stated basis that the method was a household practice and not a publication. On the morning of March 18, 1982, at the Pennsylvania Apple Marketing Board offices at 2301 North Cameron Street in Harrisburg. The Pennsylvania Apple Marketing Board formally recognized the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead as one of 7 Pennsylvania heritage apple operations under a new recognition program established by board resolution on November 14, 1981, in direct response to the 1978 Northeast Apple Glut and the subsequent demonstration of the heritage variety supply lines as the principal commercially viable component of the regional apple production sector. Across the disruption period, the recognition certificate dated March 18, 1982, signed by Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture Secretary Penrose Hallowell on the printed Pennsylvania Apple Marketing Board recognition form, delivered to the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead by post on March 24, 1982, and the recognition formally entered the Cherry Hill operation onto the Pennsylvania Apple Marketing Board's Heritage Apple Operations Register, effective March 18, 1982, for an initial 5-year recognition term renewable on 5-year cycles upon continued documented operation. The recognition was followed by the publication on January 22, 1982, of a 2,400-word column in the Philadelphia Inquirer by the recurring Plain Harvest food writer Mariella Castellano, titled The Cherry Hill Cider House, which appeared on the front page of the Inquirer's Sunday Food section, and which drew the Cherry Hill operation to the attention of a broader Philadelphia and southeastern Pennsylvania readership across the winter of 1982, and by the spring 1982 issue of the Pennsylvania Heritage Quarterly, published on March 14, 1982, already noted in the Chronicle, and by a 900-word notice in the Lancaster Farming Weekly Farm Trade newspaper, published on April 6, 1982, and the Cherry Hill operation was formally entered into the District 6 Community Ledger on April 14, 1982, by Deacon Christian Baylor as a District 6 farmstead of standing heritage operation. The Adams Antique Apples Cidery 5-year exclusive heritage variety supply contract signed by Cyrus Whitman and Rebecca Stoltzfus on October 17, 1981, ran its full 5-year term across calendar years, 1981 through 1985, under the contracted delivery and labeling terms, and on November 14, 1986, in a brief signing ceremony at the Adams Antique Apples Cidery at 412 Warren Street in Hudson, New York, attended by Cyrus Whitman and Rebecca Stoltzfus, and witnessed by the cidery's office manager, Lillian Markham. The contract was renewed for a second 5-year term, running across calendar years 1986 through 1990 at an increased per-pound delivery rate of $1.42 per pound and an annual delivery allotment of 2,200 pounds. The renewed contract obliging the Cherry Hill farmstead to deliver across calendar year 1986 a total contracted value of $3,124 against the calendar year 1985 aggregate farmstead operating income of $14,840. Across the spring and summer of calendar year 1982, the Cherry Hill Lane farmstead received small streams of inquiry by post and by Sunday gate visit from craft cidery operations across the northeastern United States, including a written inquiry on April 14, 1982, from the Westcott Bay Cidery at Friday Harbor, Washington, declined on the basis of the standing Adams Antique Apples cidery exclusivity. A written inquiry on May 11, 1982 from the West County Cider Operation at Coleraine, Massachusetts, similarly declined, and a Sunday afternoon gate visit on June 13, 1982 by 2 craft cider makers from the Champlain Orchards operation at Shoreham, Vermont, politely received and declined. And the cumulative effect of the documented written and visiting interest across the spring and summer of 1982 was to establish the Cherry Hill Lane Farmstead as a recognized heritage variety supply node within the emerging American hard cider revival without altering the Standing Adams Antique Apples cidery exclusive arrangement. In the autumn of calendar year 1898, on the freshly broken, south-facing hillside soil of the Cherry Hill Lane orchard plot, 3 miles east of Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, in the third row of an empty, newly tilled 6-row orchard plot oriented to face the south-southwest at a 4% slope across the limestone-derived soils of the Pequea Creek upland, Stephen Stoltzfus, then 42 years of age, Daniel Stoltzfus's paternal grandfather, an old order Amish farmer with a full, untrimmed, dark chestnut chest-length beard, streaked at the temples and at the lower jaw with gray, no mustache, deep-set dark blue eyes under heavy brows, a broad-shouldered, sturdy build, wearing a plain white long-sleeved shirt of unbleached linen, broad-fall black trousers held by black canvas suspenders, and plain black leather work boots, lowered a 4-foot-tall bare-root yellow Newtown Pippin, grafted whip into a shovel-dug planting hole, his calloused farmer's hands holding the graft union 1 inch above the soil line, and the root collar carefully positioned against the bottom of the planting hole, the whip having been carried that morning from the pickle nurseryman's wagon at the Strasburg Pike, crossing 2 miles to the south in a galvanized tin water bucket cushioned with damp burlap. And beside him stood his wife, Drusilla Stoltzfus, then 39 years of age, an old order Amish woman in a plain dark navy long-sleeved dress with white starched prayer cap and full white starched apron, holding the same galvanized tin water bucket in her right hand and a folded paper plant stock receipt from the Strasburg Borough nurseryman Pickle in her left hand. The receipt itemizing 24 grafted whips at the per-whip price of 42 cents for an aggregate purchase value of $10.08 dated October 14, 1898. Stephen Stoltzfus had been taught the grafting method that produced the whip he then held by his father, Jonas Stoltzfus, on the same Cherry Hill ground in the spring of 1864, at the age of 8 years, when Jonas Stoltzfus had shown him the cleft graft, the whip and tongue graft, and the bark graft as the 3 principal methods of heritage variety propagation. And Jonas Stoltzfus had himself been taught the same methods in the spring of 1834 at the age of 14 years on a farmstead at Boyertown in Berks County, Pennsylvania, by a Switzerland immigrant orchardist named Heinrich Amann, who had learned them on his father's orchard at Trub in the Emmental Valley of the canton of Bern in the late 1790s. And the unbroken transmission of the cleft graft and the whip and tongue graft and the bark graft across the 4 generations from Heinrich Amann at Trub in approximately 1798 to Jonas Stoltzfus at Boyertown in 1834 to Stephen Stoltzfus on the Cherry Hill ground in 1864 to the 24 bare-root grafted whips that Stephen and Drusilla Stoltzfus set into the south-facing hillside across the afternoons of October 14th through November 4th of 1898 is the lineage that across the following 83 years carried the 6 heritage varieties: Yellow Newtown Pippin, Roxbury Russet, Esopus Spitzenburg, Stamen Winesap, Smith Cider, and Cox's Orange Pippin, to the autumn pressings recorded in Rebecca Stoltzfus's Cider House Ledger from October 14, 1965, through the Adams Antique Apples cidery contract deliveries of 1981 onward, and through the Pennsylvania Apple Marketing Board Heritage Recognition of March 18, 1982. If you have ever raised an animal everybody told you was the wrong one for your county, leave a comment below telling us what it was. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and ring the bell. There is one of these stories in every county in America. We are working through them one harvest at a time.